Hey, how are you? 30 shy 1%.
Welcome back to the Sunday Morning Cafe podcast for Sunday, May 24th of 2026. This week, we'll be examining maybe the most difficult topic when it comes to resilience research, the facing of one's own diminishment and death. Now, not in a morbid way, but in a way that actually leads to more happiness and more resilience in this life. I'm Tom Wagner, the author of this podcast and the blog article that accompanies it. So, when it comes to death, I've always wondered how I'll face it when my time comes. Uh, despite the fact that I'm definitely on the back end of middle aged, somehow death still feels unreal to me. Resilience and happiness researchers are of one mind. If you want deep happiness, ground yourself in a wholehearted commitment to what's real, even if what's real is hard, even if what's real is unwanted. Well, death is pretty real, and it's pretty hard, and it's pretty unwanted too. The spiritual masters of every tradition agree with this wholehearted commitment to reality, especially when it comes to accepting how quickly life passes away. That's why you'll find spiritual practices for the contemplation of the inevitability of death, and not just death generically, but one's own death. You'll find that in just about every tradition. For example, there's that famous painting by Caravaggio that shows St. Francis with a skull in his hand. That portrait envisioned the 12th century monk seeking the same kind of revelation that Buddhists have always sought in the meditative practice of Maranasati, the meditation on one's own death. Those who absorb the wisdom of these practices describe a greater realism about their lives. This leads to a kind of intentionality and an appreciation of the days that still remain in this life. For less brave, less enlightened souls, which probably includes most of us, if we're honest, serious illness and diminishment, inclusive of death, are more like theoretical things that happen to others who are either unlucky or really, really old. For my friend Mary, the theoretical suddenly took flesh in her own body. I bumped into her a few years ago at a retreat center. A brief conversation in passing revealed that at 65, she'd been diagnosed with a rare degenerative neurological disorder that sure looked like there was a better than 50-50 chance that the disorder would take away most of her capabilities and then take away her life. During that brief little encounter with her at that retreat center, she gave me a thumbnail sketch of all of this. Within that bare bones outline of the experience, she recollected a crushingly beautiful exchange with her husband and sons when she was going through all this. It was that exchange that made me want to catch up with her after the retreat so that I could sit down with her for a full resilience interview. As you might recall, I have an abiding interest in studying what makes people resilient. I wanted to know what Mary's forced experience of Maranasati might reveal about resilience in the face of death. In other words, it seemed like Mary was able to hold on to her peace and equanimity in the face of death. I just wanted to know, how'd she do that? The interview. So, when it came for the day of the interview, Mary welcomed me into her comfortable middle class home that she and her husband had lived in for over 26 of their 44 years of marriage. Together, they raised two boys, now both married at 42 and 39 years of age. Mary was proud to introduce me to the pictures of her current grandkids, a 5 and a 3 year old of the time. She explained that she and her husband, Pat, were waiting on the birth of her third grandchild any minute now. A kind of simple elegance in art and architecture graced the open floor plan of this house. It glistened in the morning light, which prefigured the quality of the interview Mary would give me. The well ordered characteristic to every room mirrored the way that she would tell me her story, in the way I suspected she did most things in her life: methodical, neat, but also with a great deal of open hospitality. Everywhere I looked, I saw evidence of a full life. Now, Mary's a seasoned physical therapist. She knows how to relay medical information, which must be why she didn't waste any time. She got right down to the business of relating complex anatomy, physiology, and pathology in terms a layperson like me could grasp. On the other side of all of that, I asked her to take me back and introduce me to the experience of her illness as it slowly insinuated its way in her body and into her life. A stealthy intruder. I'll quote her here. At first, I wasn't altogether sure that I wasn't just suffering grief from my mom's long illness and death. In January of 2018, her 89-year-old mom finally gave up the ghost after a series of fractures, health complications, and hospice too. Mary was her mom's medical power of attorney as well as her caregiver and companion. Her eventual death created space for Mary to catch up with her exhaustion and grief. The knowledge of her dad's death shortly before her mom's decline illustrated the weight Mary and her family had borne for years. The story before the story involved a physical therapist who practiced what she preached, and that was Mary. For decades, yoga kept her strong and balanced. Jogging kept her fit. Over the course of 10 years, she'd engaged in sprint triathlons, which involve a half a mile swim, a 13-mile bike ride, and a 5K run. Gradually, she began to notice odd things, like a lack of balance in yoga classes. There was that all of a sudden precipitous loss of 10 pounds. She figured that, and I'll quote her, well, this could all just be me catching up with my grief. After a thorough physical exam, complete with blood work, all signs seemed to validate that a round of grief therapy was in order. But, despite grief counseling, the symptoms that had accumulated were growing. Soon she noticed that during her customary runs, her gait just felt funny. She'd catch a toe on her normal reps up and down stairs at the park. The sprint triathlete, jogger, yoga practitioner, and normally fit PT would have to take a rest while her companions biked on without her. Nearly a year into this odyssey, while watching her son's wedding video, she noticed herself limping up the aisle next to her husband. I'm going to quote her again. I'm a medical woman in a medical family, but it took me watching that video to recognize that something way beyond grief was at work in my body. In her next trip to her internist, at her husband's suggestion, she requested a brain scan. Something truly startling emerged from those images. Next section, a degenerative neurological disorder. What came next in our interview was a thorough anatomy and physiology lesson. Her scan revealed swollen brain ventricles indicating a buildup of cerebral spinal fluid. The most logical diagnosis for this array of symptoms was a thing called normal pressure hydrocephalus, or NPH. Like other degenerative neurological diseases, the NPH patient will likely suffer eventual dementia and inability to walk and incontinence until death brings eventual relief from all of that. Ouch. As a matter of fact, during the subsequent year after that diagnosis, Mary suffered all of these ailments and a list of nearly a dozen others. I wasn't functioning, she said. I was losing function. Next section, a new diagnosis and a long shot. As 2019 wound down, Mary's healthcare team had her complete a 40-page assessment tool, which led to an interview with a neurologist in the NPH program in St. Louis Barnes-Jewish Hospital. This, in turn, resulted in a referral to a neurosurgeon who ordered a 4.5-day round of inpatient diagnostic testing. As a result of this workup, her diagnosis shifted from normal pressure hydrocephalus and pH, for which there are only procedures to slow its inevitable progression, to the extremely rare obstructive hydrocephalus, OH. Unbelievably, Mary's neurosurgeon was one of the few clinicians in the world with some experience in surgically repairing the obstructive hydrocephalus. So, this shift in diagnosis meant there could be a potential long shot surgical procedure to remove the obstruction. Well, so at this stage of the interview, Mary's tone shifted into a kind of childlike wonder as she described the endoscopic roto-rooter that would allow cerebral spinal fluid to drain from her stopped up brain ventricles to be absorbed and discarded the way a brain is supposed to absorb and discard those fluids. The diagnosis, unbelievably rare. The intervention, rarer still. This made prognosis for recovery nearly impossible. The medical team laid out a sobering set of potential outcomes. One outcome? The surgery could result in brain injury and more disability. This could possibly necessitate living the rest of her life in a skilled nursing facility. Another possible outcome? Death. A third potential outcome? Well, no impact at all. The surgery wouldn't do any good. The fourth and final possibility represented Mary's hope and the hope of her healthcare team that she'd get some measure of progress in winning back at least parts of her life. What was Mary's decision? What was Mary's family decision? With almost no hesitation, it was full steam ahead. And here's where we get to the core of Mary's resilient story. One solid cognitive strategy that some psychotherapists, like me, employ to take the power out of catastrophic ruminations is something I call the then what strategy. The therapist asks the client to imagine the catastrophic outcome he or she is perseverating on and ask this kind of a question. If this horrible fear comes to pass, then what would you do? If this technique succeeds, as intended, the cognitive psychotherapist will have assisted her client in realizing the deep and abiding truth as portrayed in the Eagles' 1972 song, Peaceful, Easy Feeling. I get a peaceful, easy feeling, and I know you won't let me down, 'cause I'm already standing on the ground. On the eve of the surgery, Mary displayed an unimaginable degree of groundedness in the face of her own potential accelerated diminishment and death. That's when she initiated a conversation with her husband and sons. She wanted to tell them that in no uncertain terms that she was, quote unquote, at peace with any of the outcomes that could occur, including disability, including even death. After I posed a couple of annoying clarifying questions, she assured me, I wasn't just saying that to make them feel better. It was true. That is how I felt. I was at peace. So this pre-surgery summit was the part of her story that she briefly related to me a month ago. That's what caused me to request the interview in the first place. I remembered thinking, what could possibly test one's resilience more than one's own diminishment and death? I wanted to find out, where does a person go to gain purchase on the kind of spiritual and psychological grounding that made that conversation with her family possible? The great presidential scholar Arthur Schlesinger, easy for you to say, Arthur Schlesinger illustrated the simple formula at the root of towering leadership. He said, inherent gifts plus a huge crisis equals transcendent leadership. This podcast is part of a two-part series. This week, you just heard the huge crisis part of Mary's equation. She called it her tumble dry on high experience. That's the crisis part. Next week's installment will return to Mary's story to examine the predicates of that basic equation, huge crisis plus inherent gifts, at the heart of a resilience or groundedness story, if you prefer. In the meantime, as a way to provide a tease to the next episode of her story, maybe you could conduct a little research of your own. Find one of your best friends and discuss a time when you felt tumble dried on the high setting. In other words, when was a time of great challenge for you? What kept you grounded or helped you to return to ground? And I'll catch up with you again next week to get down to the inherent gifts that Mary found within her life that allowed her to measure up to that huge crisis. And you'll get to find out what came next.